Before we begin, if you enjoy wandering through the shadowy corners of history with a mix of dread and dry amusement, consider subscribing to your Nightfall Notions for more tales that twist the past into something strange, unsettling, and occasionally absurd. Tonight, we step into a world where suspicion was a currency and a single whisper could unravel a life. Chapter 1. The Accusation. How it all began. The first thing Agnes noticed was the silence. Not the usual quiet of the village at dusk when the farmers trudged home and the chickens clucked their way to roost. This was a different silence, thick and deliberate, the kind that clung to the air like the smell of smoke after a fire. She had walked this path 1,000 times, basket in hand, nodding to neighbors who nodded back. But today, the nods were stiff, the greetings muttered into chests, the eyes that met hers skittering away like beetles under a lifted stone. Agnes was not a woman given to paranoia. At 46 she had survived 2 husbands, a bout of plague, and the time her cow ate an entire loaf of bread, and then looked at her as if it were her fault. She knew the rhythms of village life, the grudges, the gossip, the way a story could twist as it passed from mouth to mouth. But this was different. This silence had teeth. It was Margaret, the brewer's wife, who broke it. Agnes had stopped to admire Margaret's new linen, hung out to dry in the weak spring sun. "Fine work," Agnes said, because it was, and because Margaret had always been proud of her weaving. Margaret's hands stilled on the cloth. She did not look up. "Aye," she said, and then, so low Agnes almost missed it, "They say you cursed the widow Hale's barley." Agnes blinked. "What?" Margaret's fingers tightened on the linen. "Her barley rotted in the field. All of it, she says it was you." Agnes laughed. It was the only sensible response. Widow Hale's barley had been failing for years, and everyone knew it was because the woman planted it too early and prayed over it too late. "And how exactly did I manage that?" Agnes asked, still grinning. Margaret's gaze flicked up, then away. "You were seen, walking the rows at night, talking to the air." Agnes' smile faltered. She had walked the fields at night. Yes, because Widow Hale's land bordered her own, and because Agnes liked the cool air and the way the moon silvered the stalks. As for talking to the air, well, she sometimes muttered to herself, who didn't? But she knew, even as she opened her mouth to explain, that it wouldn't matter. The accusation had been made. It was out there now, rolling through the village like a dropped spindle, gathering threads as it went. By sundown, it wouldn't just be the barley. It would be the stillborn baby last winter, the milk that soured in Widow Hale's pail, the rash that spread among the children after Agnes handed out apples at the harvest feast. Agnes tightened her grip on her basket and kept walking. She passed the blacksmith shop, where the men usually gathered to trade news and lies. The conversation died as she approached. She felt their eyes on her back as she passed, heard the murmur that rose in her wake. At home, she barred the door. Not because she thought it would help. If they came for her, a bar wouldn't stop them, but because it made her feel better. She lit a candle, though it was still light outside, and sat at her table, staring at the rough wood grain. This was how it began then. Not with flames or shackles, but with a whisper. A story told in the wrong ears. A neighbor's fear, sharpened into suspicion. Agnes had heard the tales, of course. Who hadn't? Women dragged from their homes, pressed with stones, bound and thrown into water to see if they floated. She had always thought it happened to other people, in other villages, to women who were foolish enough to draw attention to themselves. And yet here she was. A woman who talked to her cat and grew herbs that sometimes worked too well. A woman who had outlived 2 husbands and still had all her teeth. A woman who, as of today, had a shadow trailing her steps, growing longer with every silent glance. Outside, a dog barked. Agnes yumped. She realized she was holding her breath. She let it out slowly, listening to the sounds of the village settling into night. Somewhere, Someone was deciding what to do about her. She wondered how long she had before they knocked. Chapter 2. The Interrogation, Questions Under Candlelight. They came for Agnes just before dawn, when the sky was the color of a fresh bruise. The knock was polite, almost hesitant, as if the men outside were still deciding whether they believed their own accusations. Agnes had not slept. She had spent the night staring at the ceiling, listening to the mice scuttle in the walls, wondering if this was how a rabbit felt when it heard the hounds circling. The door creaked open to reveal 3 men. Father Thomas, his face pinched with the solemn duty of a man who had never once doubted his own righteousness. Constable Heron, who smelled faintly of last night's ale and looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, and a thin, twitchy man Agnes didn't recognize, clutching a ledger like it was a holy relic. Agnes Fletcher, Father Thomas intoned as if she didn't know her own name. You are to come with us for questioning. Agnes considered slamming the door. She considered laughing. She considered asking if they really thought a woman who couldn't even keep her cabbages from being eaten by slugs was capable of blighting crops and cursing infants. Instead, she wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped outside. The walk to the church was longer than it should have been. The village, usually bustling at this hour, was eerily still. Curtains twitched in windows. A child pointed before its mother yanked it inside. Agnes kept her chin up. She had done nothing wrong. That, she thought, might not matter. The interrogation room was little more than a storage closet off the church's nave, repurposed with a table, 2 chairs, and a single candle that guttered in the draught. The air smelled of mildew and old incense. Agnes sat where they told her. The twitchy man, now introduced as Clark Lowry, opened his ledger and licked the tip of his quill with the enthusiasm of a man who had never once considered where that quill had been. Father Thomas began with the expected questions. Had she ever consorted with the devil? Had she flown by night? Had she attended the witch's Sabbath, where, according to the good father, Satan himself served roasted infants on silver platters? Agnes answered patiently, though she couldn't resist asking, if I'd been to a feast with roasted infants, wouldn't I look better fed? This was a mistake. Father Thomas' nostrils flared. Clark Lowry scribbled furiously. The questions grew stranger. Had she ever kept a familiar? Agnes admitted to having a cat. But she's a terrible mouser, she added. If she's a demon, she's a very lazy one. Had she ever used herbs to heal? Yes, Agnes said, same as any woman with half a wit. Had those herbs ever worked too well? Agnes hesitated. Once she had given Margaret's son a poultice for his fever, and the boy had recovered by morning. She had thought nothing of it at the time. Now she saw the trap. Then came the truly absurd questions. Could she float? Had she ever turned into a hare? Did she own a broom? And if so, had she ever ridden it? Agnes, despite herself, laughed. If I could fly, do you think I'd still be living in a house with a leaking roof? Father Thomas was not amused. He leaned forward, the candlelight carving deep shadows under his eyes. Agnes Fletcher, he said, do you know why you're really here? She did. It wasn't about the barley, or the cat, or the poultice. It was about the fact that she had no husband, no sons, no one to speak for her. It was about the way she sometimes smiled at the wrong moments, or refused to lower her eyes when the men spoke. It was about the simple, unforgivable crime of being a woman who did not make herself small. The interrogation stretched on. They asked if she had ever made a pact with the devil. Agnes, exhausted, said if I had, do you think I'd have let my last husband die of the flux? The man couldn't even chop wood without whining. Clark Lowry's quill paused. Father Thomas' mouth tightened. Finally they brought in the pin. A thin, sharp thing, meant to probe for the devil's mark, a spot on her skin that wouldn't bleed, wouldn't feel pain. Agnes held out her arm, too tired to protest. The needle pricked. She flinched. Blood welled. Father Tomas looked almost disappointed. They let her go at dusk, with a warning to remain in the village. Agnes walked home through the gathering dark, her mind buzzing with the absurdity of it all. She had survived the day. But she knew, as she barred her door again, that this was only the beginning. The questions would keep coming, and sooner or later they would find an answer that satisfied them. Chapter 3. The Confession, extracted by any means. Agnes lasted 3 days before they came for her again. This time, there was no polite knock. The door crashed open before she could rise from her chair, and 2 men she didn't recognize hauled her to her feet. They smelled of sweat, and something metallic, like old knives. Father Tomas stood in the doorway, his face unreadable in the pre-dawn gloom. "You will come with us now," he said, and it was not her request. They took her to the church cellar, a place Agnes had only glimpsed before, when fetching ale for harvest feasts. The room was low-ceilinged and damp, the air thick with the scent of earth and mildew. A single torch guttered in its bracket, casting long, wavering shadows. A stool stood in the center of the room, and beside it, a table. On the table lay an assortment of objects that made Agnes' stomach tighten. Coils of rope, a set of iron weights, a jug of water, and a narrow wooden board with straps at either end. Father Tomas gestürte the stool. "Sit up, begessen Tag." Agnes sat. The questioning began much as it had before, but this time there was an edge to it, a hunger. They asked again about the devil, about curses, about her supposed nocturnal flights. Agnes gave the same answers. No, she had never met Satan, though she'd known a few men who'd made decent attempts at impersonating him. No, she couldn't fly, unless tripping over her own feet counted. Father Tomas sighed. "Agnes," he said, as if speaking to a particularly slow child, "we know you are lying. The evidence is overwhelming. Confess, and your soul may yet be saved." "What evidence?" Agnes asked. The twitchy clerk, Lowry, produced a scrap of parchment. "Witnesses attest that you were seen dancing in the fields under the full moon. I was checking my cabbages for slugs. John Thatcher's son claims you cursed him when he stole apples from your tree. I told him if he took one more, I'd box his ears. Hardly a curse, unless the boy's never met a crabby old woman before." Father Tomas's patience wore thinner with each exchange. Finally, he nodded to one of the men, who stepped forward with the wooden board. Agnes eyed it. "Planning to measure me for a coffin?" "No," Father Tomas said. "This is for your own good." They called it the wakefulness chair, a clever name for a brutal thing. They strapped her wrists to the board, forcing her arms out straight, then tied iron weights to her fingers. The pain was immediate, a hot, insistent pull on her joints, as if her bones were being slowly pried apart. They left her like that for hours, the weights dragging her fingers downward, the stool's edge digging into her thighs. Every time she sagged, every time her eyelids fluttered, someone would shout, or pour water over her head, or pinch the soft flesh of her arm. Sleep deprivation, Agnes learned, was a special kind of torment. It didn't just exhaust the body, it unraveled the mind. Shadows moved where there were none. Voices whispered in the corners of the room. The torchlight swam like liquid gold, and sometimes when she blinked she saw things, faces in the grain of the wood, figures flickering at the edge of vision. By the second day, her answers grew slurred. By the third, she began to doubt her own memories. Had she ever walked the fields at night? Had she spoken to something unseen? Maybe she had. Maybe she'd done worse. They varied their methods. Sometimes it was the weights. Sometimes they forced her to kneel on the stone floor, her arms outstretched until her muscles trembled and her knees screamed. Once, they made her stand barefoot on a cold iron plate while they droned scripture at her, the metal leaching the heat from her body until her toes went numb. The worst part wasn't the pain. It was the absurdity. The sheer, ludicrous theater of it all. Men who couldn't tell a fever from a chill were suddenly experts in demonic possession. A woman who'd once burned her own stew was now a master of satanic feasts. Agnes would have laughed if she hadn't been so tired. On the fourth day, they brought out the needles. Long, thin things, meant for probing the flesh in search of the devil's mark, a spot that wouldn't bleed, wouldn't feel pain. Agnes, half mad with exhaustion, barely flinched as they jabbed her arms, her legs, the soft skin behind her ears. Every prick drew blood. Everyone. Father Tomas's mouth grew tighter with each failure. Finally, he leaned close. His breath smelled of stale bread and wine. "Agnes," he murmured, "confess. Admit your sins, and this will end. You'll be forgiven. You'll sleep." Agnes stared at him. Her vision swam. Her throat was raw from thirst. Somewhere distantly, she recognized that this was the point. To break her down until confession seemed like mercy. And then, in a moment of clarity, she realized something else. They would never stop. They would keep at this for days, weeks, however long it took, because they needed her to be guilty. The village needed a witch. The church needed a victory. And Agnes needed it to be over. So she did the only thing left to her. She confessed. Yes, she said, she had cursed the barley. Yes, she had flown by night. Yes, she had danced with the devil, though in truth he'd been a terrible partner, all left feet and sweaty palms. She spun the tale as wildly as she could, if only to see how much they'd believe. The answer, as it turned out, was everything. Father Tomas sighed in satisfaction. Clark Lowry scribbled furiously. The men who held her down exchanged glances, as if surprised it had been so easy. Agnes, sagging in her bonds, felt nothing but a dull, hollow relief. It was done. She had given them what they wanted. She just hoped, in whatever came next, that they'd let her sleep. Chapter 4. The Neighbor's Testimony. Betrayal over bread. Agnes had expected the trial to be swift. She had, after all, confessed. What more did they need? But justice, it seemed, had an appetite for ceremony. The village elders decreed that witnesses must be heard, evidence weighed, and the full extent of her sins laid bare for the edification of all. So they dragged her before the assembled town, wrists bound, face gaunt from days without sleep, and let her neighbors take their turn. First came Widow Hale, of the famously blighted barley. She clutched her shawl like a shield, and spoke in the trembling tones of a woman who had never before been the center of attention. "She walked my fields at night," the widow declared. "I saw her from my window. She touched the stalks, and 3 days later they blackened and died." Agnes, squinting against the sunlight, almost laughed. She had touched the barley, yes, to snap off a few heads to check for mold, something any farmer might do. But no one asked for context. No one ever did. Next was John Thatcher, his son, the would-be apple thief, clutching his sleeve. "My boy took ill after she cursed him," John claimed. "Fever for a week, couldn't keep so much as a sip of water down." Agnes remembered the boy's fever. She also remembered the half-rotten pork the Thatchers had served at Michaelmas, which had left half the village groaning for days. But no one mentioned the pork. Then came Margaret, the brewer's wife, the woman whose linen Agnes had once complimented. Margaret's testimony began haltingly, as if she herself wasn't quite convinced, but under Father Tomas's prodding, her voice grew stronger. "She gave my boy a poultice last winter," Margaret said. "The fever broke by morning, too quickly, unnaturally so." This at least was true. Agnes had given the boy a paste of yarrow and honey, a remedy her mother had taught her. It had worked. That, apparently, was now a crime. But the real surprise came when Goody Hester took the stand. Goody Hester was Agnes' nearest neighbor, a woman of 60 with a back bent like a hook from years of scrubbing floors. They had shared bread, traded herbs, even sat together through the long winter nights mending clothes. If Agnes had called anyone a friend, it was her, which made it all the worse when Goody Hester pointed a gnarled finger and said, "She cursed my bread." A murmur ran through the crowd. Agnes, despite herself, straightened. "What?" Goody Hester's eyes darted away, then back. "Last Martinmas, I baked a loaf with raisins in it, gave her half. Next morning, it was hard as stone, not a crumb to be had." Agnes blinked. She remembered the bread. It had been dry, yes, but that was because Goody Hester had left it too long in the oven. They'd laughed about it at the time, dunking the tough slices in ale to soften them. Now, it was proof of witchcraft. Father Thomas leaned in. "And you believe this was the result of a curse?" Goody Hester hesitated. Then, perhaps sensing the weight of expectation, perhaps remembering some slight Agnes had long forgotten, she nodded. "Aye, no bread turns that hard on its own." That was when Agnes understood the true horror of her situation. It wasn't just about the barley, or the fever, or the damned bread. It was about all the petty grievances and jealousies she'd never even known existed. A borrowed kettle not returned quickly enough. A compliment paid to another woman's embroidery. A day when Agnes had smiled too much, or too little, or in a way someone had deemed suspicious. The testimonies piled up, each more absurd than the last. Agnes had caused their cow's milk to sour by looking at it too long. She had made a storm come by, hanging her washing on a Tuesday. She had, according to the blacksmith's apprentice, turned into an owl and flown over the churchyard. Though impressed, the boy admitted it might have just been an actual owl. Through it all, Agnes said nothing. What was there to say? Reason had left the village the moment the first accusation was made. Now, it was just a parade of old resentments dressed up as evidence, a chance for her neighbors to unload every minor annoyance they'd ever nursed. The final blow came from an unexpected quarter. Young Tom Miller, a boy of no more than 12, who'd once begged Agnes for ginger candies. He shuffled forward, face pale, and whispered, "I saw her talking to the devil." The crowd gasped. Father Thomas's eyes gleamed. "Describe him?" Tom swallowed. "He had horns and a tail, and he promised her gold if she'd blighted the harvest." Agnes couldn't help it. She laughed. A raw, ragged sound that cut through the solemnity of the moment. "Tom Miller," she called, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Last month you swore you saw a mermaid in the duck pond." Turned out to be Mrs. Cooper's old goose with a bit of seaweed on its head. The crowd shifted. A few muffled snickers escaped. Tom's face flushed scarlet. Father Thomas quickly intervened. "The boy's truthful in his fear," he intoned. "The devil takes many forms." And just like that, it was over. The verdict was never in doubt. As Agnes was led away, she caught sight of Goody Hester's face, not triumphant as she'd expected, but pale and uneasy, as if she'd just realized what her words had set in motion. Agnes wondered if any of them truly believed she was a witch, or if in the end it was simply easier to condemn her than to admit they'd turned on a neighbor over spoiled bread and bad barley. The cell they threw her into was cold and dark. Agnes sat on the straw-strewn floor, listening to the distant murmur of the crowd outside, and waited for whatever came next. She hoped, at least, that it wouldn't involve more testimony about the bread. Chapter 5. The Witch's Mark, Hunting the Devil's Sign. Agnes woke to the scrape of the cell door opening. The straw beneath her smelt of mildew and old urine, and the thin grey light seeping through the barred window suggested dawn had only just arrived. 3 figures stood over her. Father Thomas, the ever-present clerk Lowry with his ink-stained fingers, and the squat balding man Agnes didn't recognize, carrying a leather roll that clinked when he moved. "Stand," Father Thomas ordered. Agnes stood. Her knees protested, her back ached, and her mouth tasted like stale fear. The balding man unrolled his leather bundle, revealing an array of needles, probes, and a small, cruel-looking scalpel. "I am Master Pell," he announced, as if this explained anything. "Surgeon and searcher of marks." Ah, so this was how it would be. The concept of the witch's mark was not unknown to Agnes. It was said that all who consorted with the devil bore some hidden sign, a blemish that wouldn't bleed, a patch of skin numb to pain, a third nipple through which demonic familiars might suckle. The irony, of course, was that Agnes had spent most of her life fretting over her ordinary, unremarkable body. Now suddenly, every mole and freckle was of dire importance. "Remove your garments," Master Pell said. Agnes hesitated. She was no blushing maiden. Modesty was a luxury rarely afforded to peasant women. But the thought of standing naked before these men, under their scrutinizing eyes, made her skin crawl. Father Thomas sighed. "Must we force you?" With stiff fingers, Agnes untied her laces. The air in the cell was cold against her bare skin. Master Pell lit an extra candle and motioned for her to stand in its light. Then the examination began. Pell's fingers were calloused and impersonal as they prodded her arms, her shoulders, the backs of her knees. He peered at every freckle, every scar, muttering to Clerk Lowry, who scribbled notes with the enthusiasm of a man who'd never had to undress in front of his neighbors. "Here," Pell announced suddenly, pressing a thumb to a brown mole near Agnes' collarbone. "A likely mark." He took a needle from his roll and pricked the spot. Agnes flinched, more from the anticipation than the pain. A bead of blood welled up. Pell frowned. He moved on. A scar on her forearm from an old baking mishap, pricked, bled. A birthmark at her hip, pricked, bled. A callus on her heel, pricked, bled. With each failure, Pell's expression grew more pinched. Then, near her ribs, he paused. "This." Agnes twisted to look. It was nothing. A small, pale patch where a burn from a cooking pot had healed years ago. The skin there was slightly numb, as burn scars often were. Pell's needle darted in. Agnes felt nothing. The men exhaled as one. "No sensation?" Pell demanded. Agnes considered lying, but her body had betrayed her enough already. "It's a scar. Of course it's numb." Pell ignored her. He turned to Father Thomas. "A devil's mark, clear as day." Agnes nearly laughed. "It's from a pot of soup." But they were already moving on. Pell's fingers combed through her hair, searching her scalp. He made her open her mouth, so he could inspect her gums and the roof of her palate. He even, with a clinical detachment that would have been funny under other circumstances, checked between her toes. Then, abruptly, he stiffened. Agnes craned her neck. Pell was staring at a spot on her inner thigh, a tiny raised bump she'd had since childhood. It had never bothered her, hardly even registered as part of her body, until this moment. Pell's needle hovered. The prick came, sharp and sudden. Agnes hissed. "No blood." A beat of silence. Then Pell exhaled, long and satisfied. "There, you see?" Father Thomas leaned in. Clerk Lowry's quill scratched furiously. Agnes stared at the tiny wound, willing it to bleed. Nothing. Just a pale pinprick in flesh that had for once refused to play along. "I've had that since I was a girl," Agnes said, her voice too loud in the cramped cell. "It's nothing. It's always been nothing." Pell was already packing his tools. The devil is cunning. He plants his signs early. And just like that, it was decided. The confession, the testimonies, the absurd litany of accusations, none had carried the weight of this. A tiny patch of skin that didn't bleed when poked. As they led her back to her cell, Agnes found herself fixating on the absurdity of it. A woman could be condemned for a scar, for a mole, for a body that dared to be anything other than perfectly, uniformly ordinary. She touched the spot on her thigh, the so-called devil's mark. It had been part of her for as long as she could remember. Now, it was the reason she would die. The cell door clanged shut behind her. Outside, the village went about its business, no doubt gossiping about the witch in their midst. Agnes sat on the straw, staring at the wall, and waited for whatever came next. She wondered idly if the devil would send her a thank-you note. After all, she'd just given him credit for a scar left by an ingrown hair. Chapter 6. The Trial. Theater of the Absurd. The day of Agnes' trial dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that made even the most cynical villagers pause to admire the way the sunlight gilded the church steeple. Agnes, who had spent the night picking straw from her clothes and trying not to think about the numb patch on her thigh, was led into the village square with her wrists bound. The entire population seemed to have turned out for the occasion, perched on benches, leaning against walls, even sitting on the cobblestones with their legs crossed like children at a puppet show. At the center of the square stood a makeshift dais, upon which sat the three men who would decide her fate. Father Thomas, of course, the village elder, a gout-ridden man named Willem, who had once fined Agnes for having an unseemly laugh during Mass, and the local magistrate, a pinch-faced bureaucrat who looked as though he'd rather be anywhere else. Agnes was placed on a stool facing them, her back to the crowd. She could feel the weight of their stares, the occasional whisper, the stifled laughter. Father Thomas rose. "Agnes Fletcher," he intoned, "you stand accused of witchcraft, consorting with the devil, and blighting the crops of this village. How do you plead?" Agnes looked at him. "I already confessed, didn't I?" A murmur ran through the crowd. The magistrate pinched the bridge of his nose. "For the record," he said wearily, "the accused has confessed." Father Thomas ignored this. Let the evidence be presented. And so it began. First came the physical proofs, the so-called witch's mark on Agnes' thigh, now displayed to the crowd like a particularly unimpressive trophy. A woman in the front row gasped. Agnes craned her neck to see who it was. Goody Hester, of course, clutching her shawl as if the sight of Agnes' bare leg might curse her too. Next was the matter of Agnes' cat, a scrawny creature named Malkin, who had, according to testimony, been seen speaking in human tongues to Agnes late at night. Agnes didn't bother pointing out that Malkin's idea of conversation was yowling for fish heads. Then came the spectral evidence. A farmer claimed Agnes had appeared in his barn as a ghostly figure, only to vanish when he reached for his pitchfork. A midwife swore Agnes had cursed a newborn by breathing on it, though when pressed, she admitted the child had been born blue and hadn't taken a single breath of its own. The high point, or perhaps low point, came when the blacksmith's boy testified that Agnes had turned into a hare and raced across the fields. "How do you know it was her?" Father Thomas asked. The boy hesitated, then said, with the unshakable certainty of youth, "It had her eyes." Agnes, despite herself, snorted. The trial wore on, each accusation more absurd than the last. Agnes had caused a well to dry up. It had been a dry summer. She had made a man's beard fall out. He was 60 and balding. She had cursed a woman's butter so it wouldn't churn. The woman had forgotten to add salt. Through it all, Agnes sat silently, her bound hands resting in her lap. She had learned by now that protest was pointless. Logic had left the village the moment the first accusation was uttered. Finally, the magistrate cleared his throat. "Is there anything you wish to say in your defense?" Agnes considered this. She could point out the holes in their stories. She could remind them she'd helped deliver half the children in this village, or that she'd shared her last loaf during the famine of '8. She could ask why, if she were truly a witch, she hadn't simply turned them all into toads and been done with it. Instead, she looked at the crowd, at Goody Hester's averted gaze, at the blacksmith's boy's eager face, at the dozens of villagers who had once been her neighbors, and said, "Did anyone ever consider that maybe Widow Hale just plants her barley too deep?" A beat of silence. Then Father Tomas slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. The evidence is clear. Agnes Fletcher, you are found guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to hang by the neck until dead." The crowd erupted, some in cheers, some in murmurs, most in the kind of eager chatter that suggested they were already planning where to stand for the best view. Agnes was hauled to her feet. As they led her away, she caught a glimpse of Clark Lowry's ledger, open to the day's proceedings. In sprawling script he had written, "Justice served. Trido not compensate." Agnes almost laughed. Justice? What a joke. Chapter 7. The Ducking Stool, Water as Judge and Jury. The morning of Agnes's execution dawned with an unexpected complication. The gallows had termites. This discovery, made by the carpenter as he tested the platform's stability, threw the village into disarray. A hanging required proper scaffolding. Everyone knew that. You couldn't just string someone up from an apple tree and call it justice. Not unless you wanted to look like complete barbarians. Father Tomas, ever resourceful, declared that while repairs were underway, Agnes would undergo the water test. To remove all doubt of her guilt, he announced, as if anyone still harbored doubts after the farce of a trial. Agnes, who had spent the night in chains listening to mice scurry across the floor of her cell, was too exhausted to protest. Besides, she'd heard of the ducking stool. It was supposed to be a test of innocence. If she floated, she was guilty, buoyed by the devil's power. If she sank, she was innocent, and also, presumably, dead. Either way, the village won. They marched her to the millpond, where a crowd had already gathered, their faces alight with the peculiar excitement of people about to witness something dreadful. The ducking stool was an ancient contraption, all creaking wood and rusted hinges, mounted on a long lever at the water's edge. It looked like something a drunkard might have cobbled together after a particularly vivid nightmare. As they strapped her into the chair, Agnes caught sight of Goody Hester lurking near the back of the crowd, wringing her hands. The woman had the decency to look queasy. Father Tomas raised his hands for silence. "Let the waters decide her fate," he intoned. "If she is innocent, God will protect her. If guilty, the devil's power will be revealed." Agnes, her arms pinned to the chair by leather straps, squinted up at him. "And if I drown?" "That would be God's will," Father Tomas said smoothly. "Ah, boy." So that was how it worked. The men operating the lever gave it a heave, and Agnes's world tilted. The chair swung out over the pond, suspended for a heart-stopping moment, then plunged downward. The water hit like a slap, shockingly cold, and then she was under, the weight of the chair dragging her down. The thing no one told you about drowning was how quiet it was. The crowd's jeers vanished, replaced by the muted gurgle of water, the distant plink of pebbles settling on the pond bed. Bubbles streamed from her nose as she fought the straps, her lungs burning. The chair settled into the mud, and Agnes, pinned like a butterfly to a board, had the absurd thought that at least the pond was cleaner than her cell. Above, the light wavered. The chair jerked, then began to rise. Agnes broke the surface with a gasp, the air scraping her throat like broken glass. The crowd roared. "She floats," someone shouted. Agnes, coughing up pond water, would have argued that no, she'd been pulled up, but the lever was already swinging again. Down she went, the water closing over her head once more. This time, she held her breath sooner. The pond was deeper than she'd thought, the chair sinking until her back pressed against the muddy bottom. Something slithered past her leg, an eel maybe, or just her imagination. Her chest ached. Black spots danced at the edges of her vision. Just as she thought her lungs might burst, the chair rose again. She gulped air, her whole body shuddering. The crowd's noise was a distant buzz. Father Tomas's face loomed above her, damp with sweat. "Confess," he hissed. Admit your sins, and we'll end this. Agnes spat a strand of pondweed at his feet. Go milk your own cow, she wheezed. His expression darkened. The lever swung. The third dunking was the worst. Her limbs had gone leaden with cold, her thoughts sluggish. As the water swallowed her again, she found herself thinking not of God or the devil, but of stupid, mundane things. The way sunlight dappled the forest floor in summer, the smell of fresh baked bread, Malkin the cat's ridiculous chirp when he spotted a bird. It would be funny, she thought distantly, if she died over barley and bad bread. The chair lurched upward. Agnes surfaced retching, her vision blurry. The crowd's noise washed over her in waves. Through the haze, she saw Clerk Lowry consulting his ledger. 3 dunkings, he announced. And still she lives. Clearly, the devil protects her. Agnes, dripping and shivering, managed a weak laugh. Or maybe, she coughed, your stool's just poorly made. The carpenter, who had been watching from the sidelines, looked offended. Father Tomas ignored this. The test is conclusive. Agnes Fletcher is a witch, and shall hang as soon as the gallows are repaired. As they hauled her from the chair, Agnes caught a glimpse of the mill pond, its surface smoothing back into placid stillness. The water, at least, had made no judgments. It had simply been water, doing what water did. The crowd parted as they led her away, some faces eager, some uneasy. Goody Hester had vanished entirely. Back in her cell, Agnes sat in a puddle of pond water, picking algae from her hair, and waited for the carpenter to finish his repairs. She wondered if termites tasted like chicken. Chapter 8. The Pyre. A public spectacle. The carpenter, as it turned out, worked quickly when motivated by the threat of being accused of witchcraft himself. By noon the next day the gallows stood repaired, sturdy, straight, and Agnes noted with a grim flicker of amusement, suspiciously free of termites now. They came for her at midday, when the sun was high enough to cast no shadows. The village square had transformed. A platform had been erected near the gallows, draped in black cloth, that must have been borrowed from every household in town, given how mismatched the patches were. Father Tomas stood upon it, looking solemn and self-important, while Clerk Lowry fussed with his ledger nearby. The rest of the village clustered around the edges of the square, their faces a blur of excitement and unease. Agnes' legs nearly buckled as they marched her forward. The ducking had left her lungs raw, and she hadn't been given so much as a crust of bread since her confession. Still, she kept her chin up. If she was going to die, she'd do it without giving them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. The noose was rough against her neck, the fibers scratching like dried reeds. The hangman, a traveling man hired for the occasion since no villager had wanted the job, adjusted it with a detached efficiency that suggested he'd done this many times before. Father Tomas cleared his throat. Agnes Fletcher, he intoned, you have been found guilty of witchcraft, heresy, and consorting with the devil. Have you any last words? Agnes looked out at the crowd. She saw Goody Hester, pale and wide-eyed. She saw the blacksmith's boy, bouncing on his toes for a better view. She saw the widow Hale, clutching her shawl like a talisman. She took a breath. I hope, she said, her voice hoarse but clear, that my ghost haunts every last one of you, starting with whoever keeps stealing my damn cabbages. A ripple went through the crowd. A few nervous titters. Father Tomas scowled and nodded to the hangman. The trapdoor creaked. And then, nothing. Agnes swayed, confused. The noose was slack around her neck. The trapdoor hadn't opened. The hangman was frowning at the mechanism, poking at it with a finger. A voice rang out from the back of the crowd. She's cursed it. Agnes blinked. She hadn't cursed anything. Unless, of course, shoddy craftsmanship counted as witchcraft these days. The hangman gave the mechanism a sharp kick. The trapdoor shuddered but didn't budge. The crowd murmured, some faces now tinged with fear. Father Tomas's expression darkened. The devil protects his own, he declared. Prepare the pyre. Agnes' stomach dropped. Fire was a different matter entirely. The gallows were abandoned in favor of a hastily assembled mound of wood in the center of the square. Agnes was untied from the noose, only to be dragged to a post in the middle of the pyre, her arms wrenched behind her and bound so tightly her fingers went numb. The kindling beneath her feet smelled of damp pine and old hay. As they lit the torches, Agnes found herself fixating on absurd details. The way Clerk Lorry's quill kept dripping ink on his shoes, the child in the front row sucking on a honeycomb, the lone cloud drifting across the otherwise spotless sky. The first tendrils of smoke curled upward. The crowd hushed. Agnes closed her eyes. Then a shout. A commotion at the edge of the square. Agnes' eyes flew open as the crowd parted, revealing a disheveled figure on horseback. It was the magistrate, and he did not look pleased. "Stop this at once!" he bellowed, his horse skittering to a halt at the foot of the pyre. By order of the county court, all executions require final approval from the assizes. Father Thomas drew himself up. "This woman has confessed. The evidence is clear. I don't care if she signed her name in the devil's own ledger." The magistrate snapped. "The law is the law. Untie her." For a moment, no one moved. Then, with a collective sigh of disappointment, the villagers began to disperse. The fire was doused with a hiss and a plume of steam. Agnes, her knees finally giving out, sagged against the post as someone cut her bonds. As they led her back to her cell, temporarily, until the magistrate could sort out this mess, Agnes caught Father Tomas's eye. The priest looked furious. Agnes, despite everything, grinned. The law, it seemed, moved slower than superstition. And for now, at least, that was enough. Chapter 9. The Witch Hunter's Handbook, a Guide to Madness. Agnes' reprieve lasted exactly 3 days. She spent them in her cell, picking at the blisters on her wrists from the pyre ropes and listening to the village argue outside. The magistrate's interruption had thrown everything into disarray. Father Thomas insisted the law had no authority over spiritual matters. The magistrate countered that the law had authority over everything, especially when it came to who got to burn whom in public. On the morning of the 4th day, the arguing stopped. Agnes knew why before they even opened her cell door. She could smell it, the thick, leathery scent of a book that had been handled by too many sweating, fervent hands. When Father Thomas entered, he carried it like a relic, a massive volume bound in cracked hide, its pages yellowed at the edges. The Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches. Agnes had heard of it, of course. Who hadn't? The book was infamous, a sprawling, obsessive manual on how to identify, interrogate, and exterminate witches. Written by a pair of zealots with too much time and too little mercy, it had spread through Europe like the plague, leaving paranoia and pyres in its wake. Father Thomas laid the book on the rickety table in Agnes' cell, with the reverence most men reserved for holy texts. "You will confess properly this time," he said, "according to the approved methods." Agnes eyed the book. "Is that thing as heavy as it looks? Might make a decent weapon if you threw it at someone's head." Father Thomas ignored her. He flipped to a dog-eared page and cleared his throat. "The Malleus states that witches are most commonly found among women, as the female sex is naturally more susceptible to the devil's wiles. Their weakness of mind and body makes them prone to—" "Let me guess," Agnes said. "It was written by a man." Father Thomas turned another page. "Witches often bear marks upon their bodies, invisible to the untrained eye, where the devil has touched them. You already poked me with enough needles to stitch a quilt." Silence. Father Thomas's finger traced a line of text. "The witch may be known by her inability to weep during interrogation." Agnes, who had been too dehydrated from the ducking stool to produce tears, said nothing. The interrogation that followed was a farce, even by the standards of her previous trials. Father Thomas consulted the Malleus after every question, as if Agnes' answers needed to be cross-referenced with the ravings of two long-dead monks. Had she ever copulated with the devil? The book insisted most witches did, often in the form of an incubus. Agnes pointed out that if the devil was going to seduce anyone, he'd probably aim higher than a middle-aged peasant with bad knees. Father Thomas read aloud. Witches often poison livestock by breathing upon them. Agnes sighed. I breathe on my cat all the time. He's fine. The Himalayas says cats are common familiars. Then it's a good thing mine is useless. The questions grew more absurd. Could she summon storms? Had she ever transformed into an animal? Did she steal penises and keep them in bird nests? This last one made Agnes pause. Do I look like a woman who collects spare cocks? What became clear as the hours dragged on was that the Malleus wasn't a guide to finding witches. It was a script for inventing them. Every natural misfortune, every personal grudge, every strange but harmless habit could be twisted into evidence. A woman who healed too well was suspicious. A woman who healed poorly was cursing her patients. A woman who knew herbs was dangerous. A woman who didn't was clearly hiding something. By the time Father Thomas reached the chapter on how to extract a confession when the witch is stubborn, Agnes was too exhausted to resist. She admitted to everything. Yes, she'd flown by night. Yes, she'd cursed the barley. Yes, she'd attended the witch's Sabbath, where the food was terrible, and the dancing even worse. Father Thomas sat back, satisfied. The Himalayas had worked its magic. As they led her back to her cell, Agnes caught a glimpse of Clark Lowry's notes. He'd doodled a little devil in the margin, complete with horns and a pitchfork. It was the most accurate thing she'd seen all day. That night, as she lay on the straw, listening to the village celebrate her impending execution, Agnes wondered how many women had been condemned by that book. How many had stood where she stood, answering questions designed to trap them. Their fate sealed the moment the first page was turned. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters. Somewhere, an owl cried. Agnes closed her eyes and waited for dawn. She hoped, when they burned the Himalayas, they used her pyre to do it. Chapter 10. The Escapees, Those Who Slipped the Noose. The magistrate left on the 5th day. Agnes knew this because the village erupted into argument the moment his horse disappeared down the road. Father Thomas wanted her execution carried out immediately. The blacksmith, who had developed a nervous tic every time Agnes looked at him, suggested waiting for official approval. The mayor, sweating through his doublet, kept wringing his hands and repeating that they didn't want any trouble with the county. While they debated, Agnes sat in her cell and contemplated the lock on her door. It was a simple thing, iron and rust, the kind a child could pick with a stiff piece of straw. Not that Agnes knew how to pick locks. But she did know that the jailer's daughter, a sharp-eyed girl of about 12, sometimes brought her meals, and that the girl had a habit of humming as she worked, her fingers dancing along the keys at her belt. Agnes waited until the arguing outside reached its peak, something about the proper stacking of kindling, before rattling her cup against the bars. "Little mouse," she called softly. The girl appeared, scowling. "I'm not a mouse." "No," Agnes agreed. "You're much cleverer. Do you like honey cakes?" The girl's eyes narrowed. "What about them?" Agnes leaned forward. "The baker's wife hides them in the cupboard above the flour bin, right side, wrapped in linen." She paused. "I could tell you how I know that, but it's a long story, and you look busy." The girl hesitated. Then, with the swiftness of someone who'd spent a lifetime avoiding chores, she slipped a key from her belt and turned it in the lock. "Tell me on the way," she said. Agnes didn't need to be told twice. They slipped out the back of the jail, through the narrow alley where the butcher dumped his scraps. The girl, Annette, she said her name was, led the way, her bare feet silent on the cobbles. Agnes, stiff from days in the cell, moved like a creaky gate, but the noise of the village meeting covered their escape. "You're not really a witch, are you?" Annette asked, as they crouched behind the tanner's shed. Agnes considered the blisters on her wrists, the numb patch on her thigh, the way the villagers had turned on her over spoiled bread and bad barley. "Not the kind they think I am." Annette nodded, as if this made perfect sense. "My granny says people see what they want to see, especially stupid people." "Your granny sounds wise." The girl grinned and pointed to the tree line beyond the last cottages. "There's a path past the mill pond. Leads to the old Roman road. No one goes there anymore." Agnes hesitated. "What about you?" Annette rolled her eyes. "I'm going to get honey cakes, and then I'm going to tell everyone you turned into a crow and flew away." Agnes couldn't help it. She laughed. The woods were thick and green, the path barely more than a deer track. Agnes walked until her legs burned, and her breath came in ragged gasps. She walked until the village sounds faded, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant cry of a hawk. At dusk, she found the road. Ancient, weed-choked, but unmistakable. It stretched north, toward the hills, toward places where no one knew her name or her supposed crimes. Agnes Fletcher, condemned witch, took a deep breath and started walking. Behind her, in the village, she imagined the uproar, the accusations, the frantic searches. The moment they realized she was gone, let them look. Let them whisper. Let them tell stories about the witch who slipped the noose. Agnes had a new story to write. Chapter 11. The Aftermath, Ghosts of the Past. The village did not forget Agnes Fletcher. For weeks after her disappearance, they searched. Men with torches combed the woods, poking into hollow logs and peering under rocks, as if she might have shrunk to the size of a shrew. The mill pond was dragged, though everyone knew witches floated. The blacksmith's boy swore he saw her shadow flit past the graveyard at midnight, and for a month afterward, no one would walk that way after dark. Father Thomas preached sermons on the devil's cunning, how he whisked his servants away to safety when good men grew complacent. Clark Lowry, ever diligent, recorded the official verdict: "We escaped through diabolical means." No one mentioned the jailer's daughter or the missing honey cakes. But the truth was, Agnes' absence left a hole. Goody Hester found herself staring at the spot where Agnes' house had stood, now just an empty patch of earth. The villagers had burned it, of course. You couldn't be too careful. She remembered the way Agnes would laugh at her terrible bread, not unkindly, and how they'd once sat up through a winter storm, sharing stories to keep the dark at bay. Now, when she passed the blackened remains of the cottage, she walked a little faster. The widow Hale's barley failed again that year. No one blamed witchcraft this time. The soil was poor, the weather worse. But the widow sometimes caught herself glancing over her shoulder as she worked, half expecting to see Agnes walking the rows, muttering to herself. The blacksmith's boy grew into a sullen teenager who jumped at shadows. He never spoke of the trial, but sometimes, when he'd drunk too much ale, he'd mutter about owls with human eyes. Annette, the jailer's daughter, became a formidable woman with a sharp tongue and a reputation for knowing things she shouldn't. When her own daughter asked about the witch who'd escaped, Annette would only say she wasn't what they said she was. Then she'd hand the girl a honey cake and change the subject. And Agnes? Agnes walked north, following the old road until it crumbled into dirt tracks and wild meadows. She found work in a town where no one knew her name, tending goats for a widow with a bad hip and a good heart. She never spoke of the village or the trial, but sometimes on clear nights she'd climb the hill behind the goat pasture and look south, toward the place that had tried to kill her. She wondered if they still told stories about her, if children dared each other to say her name 3 times in front of a mirror, if Father Thomas ever woke in a cold sweat, convinced he heard laughter in the dark. She hoped so. The years passed. The village shrank, then grew, then shrank again. The gallows rotted. The mill pond silted up. Father Thomas died of a fever, and Clark Lowry was kicked in the head by a mule. The blacksmith's boy left for the city and never returned. But the stories remained. 100 years later, a traveler passing through the village might hear whispers of the witch who'd escaped the pyre, who'd flown away on the wind, who still walked the earth, older than any woman had a right to be. They'd point to the twisted oak at the edge of the woods, and say it grew from the stake meant to burn her. They'd tell their children not to linger there after sunset. And sometimes, when the wind was just right, it almost sounded like laughter. Chapter 12. The Modern Witch, Echoes of the Inquisition. The cafe was loud with the hum of espresso machines and the chatter of students hunched over laptops. A woman in the corner, her hair streaked with gray, stirred honey into a tea, and watched the room with quiet amusement. She had chosen this table deliberately, near the exit, with a clear view of the door. Old habits died hard. On the television above the counter, a news anchor droned about the latest scandal. A politician blaming economic woes on immigrants. A celebrity accused of witchcraft by a jilted lover. A small-town school board banning books about magic. The woman snorted into her tea. Some things never changed. A young woman slid into the seat across from her, her nose ring glinting under the cafe lights. "Sorry I'm late," she said, dropping her backpack. Class ran over. The older woman pushed a second cup of tea toward her. "No trouble." The young woman, Lalila, her name tag said, leaned forward. "So you're really her? The Agnes Fletcher from the village? That wasn't just some bullshit story you told me last week?" Agnes smiled. "Depends. Do you still want to learn about herbs?" Lila hesitated, then nodded. Agnes reached into her bag and slid a battered notebook across the table. Its pages were filled with cramped handwriting, sketches of plants, and recipes for everything from fever remedies to bread that never went stale. "Start with this, and remember, don't tell anyone where I got it." Lila rolled her eyes. I know. People are assholes about this stuff." Agnes sipped her tea. Outside, a group of protesters marched past, their signs demanding justice for some new scapegoat, their faces twisted with the same fervor she'd seen in Father Thomas's eyes centuries ago. The names changed: communists, immigrants, witches, radicals. But the game remained the same. Find the outcast, light the torch, and pretend the world was simple. "So how do you deal with it?" Lila asked suddenly. "Knowing they're still out there? Still doing the same stupid shit?" Agnes considered the question. She thought of the villages she'd fled, the friends she'd buried, the countless small cruelties she'd witnessed over the centuries. "You find the ones who ask questions," she said at last. "The ones who don't believe what they're told. You teach them what you know. And when the mob comes knocking," she tapped the side of her nose, "you make sure they're looking the other way." Lila grinned. "Ibadas." The protest outside grew louder. Agnes watched them pass, her expression unreadable. The world had changed in so many ways. And yet, "One more thing," she said, turning back to Lila. "Never let them see you flinch." The young woman nodded, her fingers already tracing the pages of the notebook. Outside, the crowd moved on, searching for their next monster. And Agnes Fletcher, the witch who refused to burn, stirred her tea and waited for the world to catch up.